everyone. Welcome back to the Content Matters podcast. I am very happy to have Alan Porter with me today. He is the founder and chief content officer at Content Pool, which is a consultancy that helps companies create greater customer experiences through the leveraging of their content. Alan has a lot of services that span around content strategy, content creation, operations, and content technology. And he is considered a thought leader in the enterprise content space, with a strong record of developing new ideas, embracing emerging technologies, introducing operational improvement, and driving business value. And he's had some pretty nice leadership roles in some enterprise content companies, Nuxio, which was acquired by Highland. He worked for OpenText. He worked for a consultancy called Simple A, which I think now they just call themselves A. But Alan also writes fiction and nonfiction books, and he has a new book coming out next year on aviation history, which we'll talk a little bit about because I find that kind of stuff interesting too. So welcome, Alan. Last time we talked, you were on the podcast in 2019, so it's been a while.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that long ago.
Yeah, I had to look it up. I took a back. I didn't think it was that long. I think that was the first year we might have started the podcast, because we're on year 6 now. So maybe the second year. But
I'm delighted to be back, and thanks for asking me.
Yeah, I think you have so much experience in this enterprise content space that it would be a crime not to have you back on it, because so much has changed and so much hasn't changed, right, in the last few years.
That's very true. There's always the illusion of change, I think, but underneath, a lot of the practices and ideas are still the same when it comes to creating content, putting it out there and distributing. The distribution channels may have changed. Obviously, when it comes to creating stuff, there's things going on at the moment I'm sure we'll touch on. But the basics are still there, the underlying basics, and one of the things we're going to talk about today is storytelling, and really, techniques don't get much older than the idea of storytelling.
No, they don't. But yeah, so let's dive into that, because people think of storytelling in a lot of different ways. But I don't know how much people really think about how important it is for customer experience.
Yeah, and it really is. I mean, I just sort of touched on it that, storytelling is something we've always done as a species, as human beings. It goes back to sitting around the campfire, telling stories of the woolly mammoth hunt we just went on, or the bison hunt, or, that's a good place to go get them, and this is the best way to sharpen your axe. Bit of technical documentation there. So, we've always told stories, and we continue to tell stories, and storytelling has been the way that we have communicated all sorts of information, be that, cultural, political, technical, or just entertainment purposes, all through human history. And we've done it through the spoken word, and then cave paintings and hieroglyphics and stuff. And then, it's only really in the last few centuries it sort of became more of a text-based thing. And to some extent, we're sort of going full circle back to a more visual world now, where storytelling is once again becoming more important, I think, in the way that we communicate with people. And it applies to all sorts of communication. Storytelling is not just about writing a novel. It's not just about doing a TV show or a movie. Storytelling is really about how we communicate an idea or a concept in a way that engages the listener, that they can then empathize with it. And for me, that's what storytelling is about. And that is key to customer experience.
Absolutely. But here's the question that I kind of come back with is, from a technical documentation perspective, you don't really hear people talk about storytelling. You hear, here's the product, write the specs, write the user guide, write the implementation guide, whatever. You don't hear people say there has to be a story, or there's a way to do it the right way.
Right. That's because we tend to be very product focused.
Yeah.
Which is great for us as engineers or product people, or, but we've got to think about our audience, and our audience are our customers. So for me, storytelling is about shifting that focus away from talking about the product to actually creating content, technical documentation, or whatever that actually is customer focused and keeps the customer center of the thing. I have this, this idea that and I will say I completely stole this from one of the senior editors at Marvel Comics. He always said that a good story is about a character who has a conflict, who makes a choice and deals with the consequences. And you're like, well, how does that apply to technical documentation or business communications? Well, if you think about it, a character is our customer. So we all have customers. They all have a conflict in the fact that they have something that they want to do. That could be, I've opened this box and I'm conflicted because I don't know how to start this piece of software. It could be, I've got this warning light on my lawnmower and I don't know what that means. I need to repair it. It could be, I've got this, flat pack bookcase to put together and I'm conflicted. My conflict is there's something that we all go to that documentation. So we all have on the way, we make choices. We either follow those instructions or we don't. Or we make mistakes and we need to learn about them. And then we deal with the consequences of those choices that we made in terms of maybe we need more trouble. We did something and it went wrong. So we need to access the troubleshooting. We need to find out more information. So we need to learning information. So for me, those 4 C's of storytelling in character, conflict, choice, and consequences applies, I think, to every single business communication as well, be that marketing, technical documentation, sales, whatever. And if you come at your process from that point of view, in terms of who my customer is, what is it they're trying to do, what choices are they going to make, what's the context? There's another C that I didn't actually put in there, which is the context. What's the context in which they're actually facing those choices, and then how do we actually help them through the consequences and move them basically onto the next step in their process. So if you take that storytelling framework, I think it fits perfectly with technical documentation, marketing content, and most sorts of. And thank you. Somebody agrees with me.
Yeah.
That's a good start.
Yeah, it's important that people agree with you, but I agree too. Like, I think that maybe the challenge, and maybe it's not a challenge, but it's that if you're not a writer necessarily, you don't think in terms of storytelling when you're doing that kind of stuff. You don't think of people, and I guess that's something you have to learn how to do, to think about the end user of your content and how they think about things.
Yeah, for me, it's 2 things. It's how do they think about it? And the other thing to think about is, what do you actually want somebody to do with this piece of content that you're creating?
Yeah.
We create a lot of content and we just throw it out into the world and we hope somebody's actually, with some of it, from a marketing point of view, we hope they find it. From a technical documentation point of view and a product point of view, we might actually hope that they don't find it, because it means the product's working and they don't need to go troubleshoot it. But you need to understand what the purpose of that piece of content is and how it's going forward. And you said in terms of writing, you don't necessarily have to be a writer. One of the things that really got me thinking about storytelling in business communications is going back several years. You mentioned Nuxeo. When I worked at Nuxeo, there was a bunch of folks from Nuxeo. We all lived in Austin, Texas at the time. And we'd get together like once a month for dinner and stuff like that. And we're having dinner. And somebody said, oh, I can't make whatever the meeting was the following day. I have to go to the toll people's office to sort out my toll tag. And everybody around the table went, oh, do I have a story for you about the toll tag?
Right.
And it went around the table and there was like 8 people around the table and there was like 8 different stories around. And I was thinking, that's 8 stories about that product and service that just came out. They're all bad. What we really need to do is get people to start thinking about delivering their content and the services that their customers will sit around a table and tell 8 good stories about dealing with that brand and dealing with that product. So it's not necessarily you have to think about it in terms of being a writer. Just think about it in terms of being yourself and the sort of experiences that you have and the stories that you tell people about the brands that you like or the brands that you don't like. And then think about that, how that applies to what you do in your day job. It's like, am I actually going to produce something? And I know it doesn't sound like, oh, we're all going to sit around and talk about technical documentation, but having been in the business for 30 years, yes, some of myself and my friends do sit around and talk about technical documentation. But if you can produce a piece of technical content that helps somebody solve a problem, then they may tell a good story about that. Oh, I was, I had this issue on my car and I fixed it really easily, or the warning really told me what to go do, and I took it to the dealers and they were really helpful, and blah, blah, blah. So it's not necessarily thinking about, oh, well, I'm not a writer, or I don't understand how to create, I'm not a storyteller. It's about putting yourself in the place of the person who's going to consume that content, and how can we help them. And I do a 2-day workshop on customer focused, outcome focused storytelling for companies. And I was doing one with a large company that produces stuff for power supplies the other week, and they were like, well, all we do is create boxes that produce electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, that's your product point of view, but they have a great story, and they have a video on it about how they actually brought light to a village in rural China, where prior to that, basically when it got dark, the village stopped. And now they brought light, and all these people their kids can do their homework. They can have pardon the pun, a more enlightened life. And it's like, that's your story, is that you change people. It's not that you have a box that produces electricity, it's that you change people's lives. In some cases, you may even save somebody's life if it's like a generator attached to a hospital that's powering an ICU.
Yeah,
You're literally, that's your story, is you're saving people's lives, or you're changing people's lives. Not, and you've got to start thinking in those sort of terms, is what is the impact of the content you're producing, and what's the impact of your product, and what's the stories that you can then pick up. And everybody has favorite customer stories. I think part of the problem with technical documentation, and it's unfortunately historical one, is it tends to be so functionally siloed that they don't docs people very rarely get access to the end customer, which is wrong, because we're writing for the end customer.
Yeah,
they very rarely get access to the marketing folks, or the people who are the sales guys who are out in the field or whatever. In my career, I've always made it a point to be really noisy and want to go out and travel with the sales guys, or go to conferences, or go out on site with customers wherever possible, just to hear the stories. And you can pick up a lot anecdotally just being around an organization, hanging out in the cafeteria. If you see somebody in sales, sit down with them and like, hey, have you had any good customer stories lately? And people just love to tell stories, and you can take that and apply that to the work that you do.
So I like that. I'm 100% that these two groups have to kind of talk to each other, not just marketing, sales, service, tech docs. They all have to kind of work together to create the content, and to kind of create the messaging around a product or a brand. But I've interviewed a lot of companies for customer stories, and I always end up talking to the technical people who don't have the marketing story. And I just wonder, how do you convince a company that those people have to work together to kind of be more consistent in how they talk about stuff?
It's not easy. Change management is hard. I have been in situations where I have literally been in a meeting with the marketing people and left the conference room and gone down the corridor and got the technical publications manager and brought him into the conference room and said, here is your technical publications guy, talk to each other. Physically brought them together. Sometimes it's actually just a question of literally showing them, and showing them that this is what their customers are searching for. Often when companies put their technical documentation out on the web, that becomes the thing that people look for the most.
Yeah.
And if you can show the marketing people that 70% of the people who are coming to your website are looking for your technical documentation, then surely you should be talking to each other to make sure you've got a consistent message. Consistent messaging is another one as well. And often sometimes the best way to do that is to actually take it to a higher level if you can, and show people at an executive level that they're putting out inconsistent messages, that the experience on the website is different than the experience on the app. I do know one program that kicked off in the medical field was kicked off basically because a very senior person at that particular medical information supplier, he looked up a piece of information on the website, and then a couple of days later, because it applied to a situation in his family. And a couple of days later, he's in line at Starbucks and he's like, oh, what about so-and-so? And he looked it up on the app and he got a completely different answer than the one he saw 2 days ago on the website. And
not
it was
good.
not good, particularly in a medical environment, but it was like, okay, we've got to do something about making sure that we're telling the same story, that we're telling the same information, that we're being consistent. And again, understanding who your customer is, what their need is, what their character is, what their conflict is, what it is they're trying to do, what the context is, and the consequences of that. If you can apply that across and get everybody together, then you can really help do that. But there is no magic answer to how do you get tech pubs and marketing. To be honest, a lot of it comes down to just going out there and asking questions and making those phone calls. Hey, I'm Fred from Technical Publications. I'd like to talk to somebody who's dealing with this product, or somebody on the product side, putting together a spec sheet or a white paper. And it's like, I wonder what we've got in our documentation about this, calling up somebody in Technical Publications, and just building that. A lot of it is just building those informal networks.
Yeah. Definitely. This was a great one. Wayne says, just to add, engineering teams have heard of this and commit code toward user stories. However, the creative team is usually pulled by the client's preferences. And that's, of course, driven by the client's organizational culture.
Yep. Yeah. So
tricky.
Yeah. I mean, culture comes down to understanding the context. And if you can get away from thinking about the internal culture and thinking about the external culture of the customers and what the context that they're consuming that content in, it can help. I'm not saying any of this is easy. It does take a lot of networking, a lot of reaching out, a lot of asking questions, sometimes changing process too. But one of the things I really like about the workshops that I mentioned I always ask, if possible, that we have people in the room from different functions. I like to get at least one person from each customer-facing function in the room for those 2 days. And for me, the favorite part of those workshops is when I actually step back and I don't say anything, and I just listen to the conversation. Let them talk and have the conversations, and you get that. Oh, we do that. Oh, well, we do that. Well, maybe we should be doing that together, or we do that and we don't do that, but maybe we should. So starting to build those bridges between those functional groups is very powerful.
So, okay, when you're doing storytelling with technical documentation, I can see it when you're writing articles, when you're writing kind of shorter pieces of content, because they evolve around a use case and you can tell a story around a use case. How do you weave storytelling into a user guide or an implementation guide?
So I've actually given this quite a lot of thought. There's a well-known screenwriting guru called Robert McKay, who has a great book called Story. Highly recommend anybody who's listening to this if you want to know about storytelling. It is about Hollywood screenwriting, but he really breaks down storytelling exceptionally well. But he has 15 rules of storytelling. What I've actually done, and it's on my website, I've taken those and applied those 15 rules to technical documentation and how you apply them. I'm not going to go through all 15 on here, but just to sort of let me very, very quickly just sort of give you an example, and pardon me, just pulling up my screen. But his first rule is that thou shalt not take the crisis or the climax out of the protagonist's hands. In other words, in the movie, make sure the hero is the guy who solves the problem, not somebody else, right? But for me, that's about making sure that we deliver an experience or documentation in such a way that the customer feels that they've completed the task themselves based on the knowledge that we've presented to them. So, you present that user guide in a way that you're empowering the user or the customer to feel like they're actually solving the issue based on what we're telling them.
Right.
So again, that comes down to maybe tone of voice, inclusive work. It's like making it about them rather than about us. It's about making things maybe short and easy to understand. It's about breaking the stuff down. So, another one I like, this is his rule number 3, thou shalt not use false mystery or surprise. For me, is like, don't hold anything back that the customer needs to know. Don't show how clever we are.
Yeah.
It's not about how clever we are. It's about making sure that the customer has all the information that they need to be able to solve their conflict, solve their problem, move along in a process. So, like I said, there's 15 of these. Is it 10 or 15? I can't even remember now. But there's a series of these, and I do have a blog post on the Content Pool website that talks through this, and I did it several years ago, and I've sort of fine-tuned it both for technical writers and for folks doing more customer experience type processes. But it's the same underlying stuff, that you can take those storytelling ideas and really apply them directly to any sort of business communication, but especially technical content. I think there's very much a direct fit.
So when you put a group of technical people, in technical writers, technical content managers, whatever, in a room, and you start talking to them like you do in your workshop, what is the first kind of, not complaint they have about the process, but just concern or challenge? So we can't do that because of this. Like, what?
I mean, that's the usual feedback, is like, we can't do that because standards. We can't do that because of legal issues. We can't do that about it's usually some regulatory thing or something like that. I did a project in the pharmaceutical industry, and that was always, oh well, we can't do that because of approvals. Everything has to go through approvals and stuff like that. So thing is, whenever anybody says you can't do that, there's always a way of addressing it in a creative way. I started out in the aerospace industry. Doesn't get much more regulated than the aerospace industry.
Thank goodness.
But out of that and the work I was doing there at that time came things like simplified technical English and controlled language. Originally it was like, well, we can't write like that because it's dumbing it down. Well, it's not dumbing it down. It's making it easier for people to read, and for translation costs, it makes it better to translate. And by the way, we're saving lives, because by making stuff clear and simple and easily translatable, it's not getting misinterpreted.
Yes.
And just to give an example, there used to be a line in the manuals that, when you were depowering the aircraft, it actually said cut the electrical power. And unfortunately, some guy actually got a pair of shears and cut the power line and was killed. So just making that change and saying, instead of cut the power to depower the aircraft, was like, we literally were saving people's lives. And it was a simple change, but it was like, oh no, we can't do that. We'll be dumbing it down. We'll be doing this. Out of that came things like the S1000D standard that allows you to do structured content and creative, reuse and stuff like that, and develop interactive technical manuals and things like that. So, whenever anybody says we can't do that, because, start thinking in terms of what you can do.
Yeah.
And how you can make small changes that can have a big impact. Going back to storytelling, if you think about the movies, some of the best movies are not the ones with the biggest budget. Some of the best movies are the ones with the smallest budgets, where they actually have to get creative about how they actually tell the story without $150 million of CGI.
Yes.
So I always like to think outside my industry, whatever industry I'm working in. I always like to look at what's going on in the world around me, and how that can inform the storytelling and what we're actually working on at the time. So, if you're working in the pharma industry and you've got a problem with regulation, maybe look at what some of the other regulated industries do. What does aerospace do? What does automotive do? What does somebody else do? If you're working on a software thing, maybe look at what some hardware equipment manufacturers are doing. You can always find other people who've faced similar issues, who may have had some really creative ideas. So in terms of storytelling, that's the usual pushback, is we can't do this, we can't do that. But it just takes a change of mindset. It's the regulations don't talk about tone of voice. The regulations don't talk about how you address stuff. They may talk about how things are, the metadata and the structure and stuff, but they don't necessarily talk about the way that you're actually telling the story, the way that you're actually creating the information. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Does storytelling, is there any impact of storytelling with creating kind of structured content in that way? Like, is there any kind of, I guess I'm not saying it right, but relationship between the two, like, because in technical documentation we talk so much about how you build your content for reuse and structure, but how do you layer storytelling into that kind of a model?
I think it's, again, understanding the context of where that piece of structured content can be potentially used, and understanding it fits in there. We may not be writing for a linear narrative as such, but again, for me, storytelling is about, as long as you're addressing those four things of understanding who the customer is, what their conflict is, what choices they're going to make, and so forth. You can create structured content pieces that align with that. So,
yeah.
I'm not talking about, for those who know it, taking Joseph Campbell's 12 Steps Hero's Journey. That applies more to marketing, but taking that and applying it to technical content. But you can, as I said, just think of it in terms of, for me, I call it storytelling, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to being focused on the customer, on how we actually help the customer achieve what it is that they're trying to achieve. And we can do that with structured content as well as anything else.
Yep, absolutely. So in terms of kind of, do you see a lot of companies struggling with adopting a storytelling kind of methodology or approach when they're creating technical documentation? And how do you get them, or what do you say to them to kind of get their heads around it a little better?
I'm seeing more people come towards it. I think that has been a fairly large shift in the last decade or so to companies understanding how important the customer experience is, be that technical documentation or anything else. And being, a lot of them have, customer experience on the CEO's checklist, something we talk about. So I really talking to them in terms of the customer stories. I'm seeing a lot, certainly in the last 6 months or so, seeing a lot more increase in interest of folks around storytelling and engagement. Again, you can see, if you can show that you get more engagement from your customers that way. Just to give an example, client I'm currently working with does a lot of safety equipment works in safety in the construction industry, and they send out a lot of safety bulletins. And they sent out one recently about a boom breaking on a crane because the guy who was working on it, repairing on it, left partway through the day, didn't finish it, didn't tell anybody he hadn't finished it. The operator got in it the next day thinking it was repaired and moved it, and the whole thing fell apart.
Oh.
The reason he left was because he had a doctor's appointment. When they sent out the service bulletin, it basically said boom failure information or something like that. It was fairly generic.
Yeah.
We got very low engagement. When we sent it out in their newsletter, we actually put how a doctor's appointment impacted a boom failure, and the engagement went through the roof because people were like, oh, I wonder what that's about. And they read it, and then they read the safety information, and they learned the lesson. And it was just a little story embedded in the incident report that we got. But it was like, okay, let's take that little piece out of the incident report and make that the focus. The human side of it. And again, it comes back to the human side, delivering content that people can empathize with and deliver a good customer experience that resonates with the person who's reading it.
Yeah. So you're almost kind of marrying a little bit of marketing storytelling with technical documentation.
Yeah, it's all storytelling. It's all customer. Yeah. But if you can find that human piece, that that nugget that somebody will empathize with or understand or go, oh, that's me, or oh, that's interesting, I wonder what happened, or I wonder how you do X, then you can get a lot more engagement. And if you can go to the head of support and say, hey, our engagements, we can drive a lot more engagement by using a different technique, or we can drive marketing folks, we can drive, get people on the website and they stay longer and read more, then you've got a powerful story to tell. Yeah.
Do you think that our use of AI for content development is going to impact how well we tell our stories?
yeah, I'm not going to get on that soapbox. That could be another another 1 hour podcast of me ranting about AI. But it's here. Unfortunately, I think at the moment it's a solution looking. Sorry, it's a technology looking for a solution. I think it's been applied too fast, too quickly, without people really understanding what it is or what it does, or more importantly, what it doesn't do. But it is here. We're going to have to deal with it. It's a tool. Use it as a tool. It's not a golden bullet. It's not an easy button. It is not creative. It doesn't, it doesn't understand context. It doesn't understand intent. It's basically just an algorithm putting words together based on statistical probabilities. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it can help in terms of generating some ideas, mm-hmm. But don't use it to be your final arbiter of what you write and publish, please. Particularly at the moment,
even from a technical documentation perspective, like
no. There's just way too much risk at the moment. So like I said, I'm very keen on adopting new technologies, but I think this one's gone too far too quickly for a whole variety of reasons. But I think it is going to be here. It is going to get better. We have to adapt to that. But at the end of the day, I don't think anything will ever beat human creativity. And the thing that, for me, that storytelling is about, it's a word I've used several times already, is about human empathy. And artificial intelligence, unless we'll get into like Skynet type stuff, and even then, it didn't have human empathy. That's the whole point of the movie. Exactly. You need a human in the loop at some point. I've worked on an AI project in the digital asset space, and that was our constant refrain as we were going through the development and testing and rolling out that product, was it needed a human in the loop.
Yeah.
And I think we're always, for AI to work properly, certainly in the short to medium term, you always need a human in the loop.
So we're not done yet. That's the good news, right?
No.
So were you a fiction writer before you were a nonfiction writer, or vice versa?
No, I probably started out, my first 2 books were nonfiction. I actually wrote several nonfiction, I write nonfiction books. I do pop culture essayists. And then I started to write fiction more recently. Yeah. So I do short stories, novellas, and stuff. But yeah.
I was looking at
comics too.
Yeah. I know. Sorry? And I was looking at your whole list, or whatever, the list of books that you wrote. And you did like a book on Star Trek.
Yes.
On 007, and I'm like
2 books on James Bond.
Yeah, super fascinating stories. Like, how did you get involved in those kind of writing projects?
Like a lot of them, I'm a geek anyway. They're areas I was interested in, and sometimes it's like, oh, I wish the James Bond one, the first James Bond one, was a history of James Bond in comics. I'm a comics guy. I also love James Bond, and it was like, nobody's ever done a history. I wonder if there's a history on a book on the history of James Bond in comics. There wasn't one. I'll pitch one, and I got the contract to write it. Cool. So a lot of it comes around that. I did a book about the early days of the Beatles and how the band formed, because at the time I wrote it, almost 20 years ago now, there was no book on that. There is now. Now somebody's done a 960-page volume on it and stuff that goes way deeper than my book. But at the time, it was like there was nobody else doing it. So a lot of it comes out that either it's an area on a subject, it's a subject that's not being covered, or it's a take on a subject that's not being covered, which is pretty much the same as you mentioned the aviation book I'm doing at the moment. That's in that category. There have been other books on the subject, but nobody's really taken the angle that I'm taking on it. So
what is your angle? Like, I assume it's a history of the aviation in some way.
It's actually about one particular plane. It's an aircraft called the Bristol Brabazon. I'm going to get geeky, a little geeky here. But it was as big as a boat. It was built first flew in 1949, so it was built after the war in the UK. It was as big as a jumbo jet. It was going to be initially double-deckered like an A380, but it came down to sort of a deck and a half, a bit like a jumbo jet, but it was bigger than a jumbo. But it was only going to carry 150 passengers in luxury across the Atlantic. There was a cinema, a full restaurant, a bullion room for a ladies' powder room, cabins with only 6 seats. There was like broken down into cabins with 6 luxury seats in them that could turn into beds, and there was like sleeper cabins above, like it's above the wing route. There was a 32-seat restaurant. It was going to be an ocean liner of the skies, basically. They built one. They built the prototype, and that was it. And it was ahead of its time. A lot of the things that you find in modern airplanes were invented for this particular aircraft, including overhead bins, powered flight controls, air conditioning, pressurized cabins, were all either invented or improved for this particular airplane, because it was such a dealing. So its DNA is in every modern commercial jet that you fly. Its DNA is woven through. A lot of people see it as a failure. It gets called a white elephant, a failure, and so forth, because it got scrapped and they never built ones that went into commercial service. It was ahead of its time technically. It was a little bit behind its time in terms of design, because it coincided with the arrival of the jet engine, because this was going to be a big turboprop thing, and the jet engine literally took off. The first jet airliner took off like 2 months before this took off for the first time. The market changed from luxuries to shove as many people in a metal tube. It went from a limited number of people in luxuries serving them food in a restaurant to as many people in a tube and give them a bag of peanuts and serve them food on their laps. It was sort of great aeroplane, wrong place, wrong time stuff. And there's been a couple of really technical books about, if you really want to know literally how every rivet was put together and how it was built, and there's some really technical books, but nobody's really talked about it in terms of the things I talked about, the politics, the changing marketplace, the social, the cultural stuff. How in the UK, when they had rationing worse than than they had during the war, on one hand they were spending millions of dollars and millions of pounds on the other hand building a huge experimental aeroplane. Why were they doing that? So that's the track I'm taking. It's the history of the plane, but within its social, political, cultural context, rather than it being a technical
I've never heard of that plane, and now I really want to get the book and learn all about it.
Well, thank you. It'll be out next year, hopefully. So
it sounds like it would make a really awesome Netflix documentary too.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. So thank you, Alan. This has been a really good conversation, and I've learned a lot about kind of working storytelling into technical documentation. I think you have a lot of really good ideas and good ways to think about stuff.
Thank you. I really enjoyed as you can tell, I'm a storyteller. I like to tell stories, and I like to talk about telling stories. And I like to teach people how to tell stories. And like I said, we do for those who may be interested, we do a 2-day workshop on telling for folks in technical documentation, marketing, and other customer-facing roles as well. So.
Yeah, we'll make sure to put a link if you have a link to that workshop in or to your website in our show notes, so that people can kind of find it really quickly and get more information on it.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right, great. So thank you to our sponsor, Ingenix, who sponsors the Content Matters podcast. They are a leading player in the field of enterprise content management and customer experience. For 20 years, actually. I think they've been working innovative content and digital experiences, everything from secure customer portals to documentation and knowledge base hubs, websites, and other self-service customer experiences. I'm really kind of tripping over my tongue today. So you can go to ingenix.com to learn more about what they do, including their web CMS and component content management products. And I would just suggest that while you're there, sign up for the newsletter, because we tell you more about all of these great podcast guests that we get on the podcast, and all this interesting stuff that we talk about. So that is it for today. I thank our LinkedIn people for commenting. That was really nice to see, and I really appreciate it. And we'll see you next month. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.